It begins not with a name, but with a whisper. A whisper that moves through the cypress trees of a Louisiana bayou, twisting through the mist like a ghost that refuses to die. The water is still, the air heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a train hums low, like the deep sigh of history itself. Louisiana. A place where the soil remembers more than it tells. Where every brick, every melody, every shadow on a French Quarter balcony feels older than the nation itself. Yet most who walk these streets have no idea whose name they carry on their tongues. They see a state. They don't see a signature, one carved centuries ago by a man who ruled an empire of light, luxury, and absolute power. A king who believed the sun rose and fell by his command. The people of this land have changed, the flags have shifted, but the name, Louisiana, has remained like a haunting refrain, echoing through wars, floods, and generations. Why? Because it wasn't just a name, it was a claim. A mark of ownership from a monarch across the sea. A mark that would shape destinies long after his kingdom turned to dust. Look closer, and the clues are everywhere. In the wrought iron balconies that shimmer under morning light, in the language that bends softly toward French vowels, in the way jazz itself seems to rise from the past and breathe again. And yet, the deeper you listen, the more you realize this isn't just history, it's a story of obsession, of empire, of one man's hunger to carve his legacy into the unknown. Because Louisiana was never meant to be just a piece of land, it was meant to be a kingdom reborn. A mirror of France itself, stretching across rivers, forests, and dreams too wild to contain. But every dream has its cost. And before long, this royal vision would meet the darkness of the New World, disease, betrayal, and the clash of civilizations, until even the name, Louisiana, began to sound less like a triumph, and more like a warning. And that story, how a king's pride birthed a land of beauty and burden, begins not in Louisiana at all, but in the gilded heart of Europe, beneath the burning gaze of the Sun King. Long before Louisiana was a state, before its streets filled with music and its air with mystery, it was nothing more than a dream whispered in marble corridors half a world away. The year was 1682, and the most powerful man in Europe ruled from a palace of mirrors, King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His throne stood at Versailles, a fortress of gold and glass that reflected only one thing, his own glory. Louis believed his reign was divine, that his power flowed from God himself. But even divinity has boundaries, and beyond the horizon lay something that could stretch them, the vast, uncharted wilderness of the New World. It was a frontier filled with danger, beauty, and endless possibility. And for a king obsessed with legacy, that was temptation enough. He wanted more than land. He wanted immortality. And so, he sent explorers, soldiers, and dreamers across the Atlantic. Men who would risk their lives to carve his name into a continent he would never touch. Among them was René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, a visionary and a fanatic, equal parts genius and madman. La Salle believed he had found a way to claim an empire in the name of France, a kingdom so vast that it would make the Sun King's shadow stretch across oceans. He sailed down the veins of a continent, guided by the thunder of the Mississippi River, a force of nature that carved its way through unknown lands like a living serpent. Every mile took him deeper into mystery, through forests untouched by Europe's machines, through lands ruled by nations older than France itself. When he finally reached the Gulf of Mexico, La Salle stood upon the edge of the known world. There, he raised the French flag, and in a single act of audacity, claimed all the lands drained by that mighty river, millions of square miles. For King Louis XIV, he called it La Louisiane. The land of Louis, not just a territory, a statement. A mark of divine right across the wilderness of the New World. And yet, this new Louisiana was not the paradise they imagined. The soil was rich, yes, but the air was heavy with disease. The summers burned, the winters punished, and the swamps swallowed men whole. Still, they built. They raised forts and trading posts, carved settlements from the wild, and carried the fleur-de-lis like a sacred fire. But it wasn't only ambition that crossed the ocean. It was arrogance, the belief that the kings could tame nature, bend it into civility. They never asked what this land wanted to be, they only named it. And in that act of naming, they planted both a dream and a curse. For every flag that rose in the king's honor, another fell to decay. For every victory written in royal ink, the wilderness wrote its own response, in storms, in fever, in blood. The crown saw beauty. The settlers saw struggle. Louisiana, even in its birth, was torn between glory and survival. And yet, for the Sun King, none of that mattered. What mattered was that somewhere, far beyond the reach of Versailles, a piece of his name now lived forever. He had turned wilderness into inheritance, river into empire, and land into legacy. But the dream was still fragile, a spark flickering in the shadow of empires that watched from across the sea. Spain. England. Nations hungry for power, circling like wolves. And so, the race began, not of men, but of kingdoms, to control the heart of this new world. It was a conquest of rivers, of alliances, of blood and faith. And soon, Louisiana would become the prize no empire could hold for long. For in this land of shifting waters and deeper mysteries, no king's name could last without a fight. And that fight, the conquest that would decide the fate of Louisiana, was about to begin. Louisiana was born not in peace, but in defiance, defiance of nature, of distance, of destiny itself. After La Salle's bold claim, the French crown saw the New World not as wilderness, but as a kingdom waiting to be tamed. And so began one of history's most daring, and doomed, experiments, the attempt to forge a European empire out of water, swamp, and faith. The French called it La Louisiane, but to those who arrived here, it felt more like a fever dream, a land half submerged, half alive. Rivers coiled like serpents through dense forests. The air shimmered with heat and insects. To survive here required not the etiquette of Versailles, but the endurance of the damned. Still, they came. Priests with crosses, soldiers with muskets, settlers with trembling hope. They followed the rivers, those liquid highways that cut through the unknown. The Mississippi, the Red, the Atchafalaya. Each one carrying them deeper into a world that refused to be owned. At the heart of it all was the river. To the French, it was more than a body of water. It was the spine of an empire. Whoever controlled it would control trade, power, and destiny itself. They called it La Fleuve Roy, the King's River, for it seemed to carry the Sun King's light into the heart of a continent that had never known him. From Quebec to the Gulf, a chain of forts began to rise, lonely outposts of stone and faith in a land of shadow and song. Natchitoches, Baton Rouge, Biloxi. Each a small spark of civilization surrounded by an ocean of wilderness. They traded beads and muskets for furs, prayers for survival. Alliances were forged with tribes, some fragile, some deep, and betrayal often followed close behind. But no dream burns forever without consuming something. The French sought to command the land, yet found themselves commanded by it instead. Swamps swallowed their crops. Fever took their children. The same river that promised wealth carried death in its current. In the midst of this chaos, one name rose from the marshes, New Orleans. Founded in 1718 by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, it was meant to be the jewel of France's southern empire. A city carved from mud and ambition, built on land that had no business holding anything at all. It was a gamble. A city below the waterline, protected only by levees and faith. But it worked, at least for a while. Ships arrived. Markets bloomed. The French crown finally had its foothold in the New World, a gateway to empire. New Orleans was not just a city, it was a statement to the world. France had conquered the Mississippi. The Sun King's dream had taken shape in timber and stone, in the voices of traders and priests, in the scent of tobacco and sugar drifting from the docks. For the first time, Louisiana began to feel real, not as wilderness, but as civilization. But deep beneath that triumph, the ground was already shifting. The same river that built the city began to threaten it. Storms tore through settlements. The earth itself rebelled against the weight of empire. And beyond the borders, rival nations, Spain, England, watched closely, hungry for the land France now claimed. The French crown poured money, men, and faith into its colonial project, desperate to hold what it could barely manage to control. For every fort razed, another fell. For every treaty signed, another war brewed on the horizon. And in the shadows of New Orleans' narrow streets, whispers began, of corruption, of despair, of a colony stretched too thin, too fragile to survive the forces closing in from all sides. Still, France persisted. Not because the land was profitable, but because it carried a name, Louisiana, and that name had become sacred. To lose it would mean more than losing territory. It would mean losing a dream, the king's dream. But dreams, like empires, have their limits, and the deeper France sank into the heart of Louisiana, the more it found that the land had its own will, a will stronger than the king's. Soon, the rivers that had once carried glory would carry ruin. The dream that had begun with water would end in blood, betrayal, and loss. And the price for the king's vision, the cost of turning wilderness into a mirror of Versailles, was about to be paid in full. Louisiana, the jewel of France's southern empire, was supposed to be the Sun King's masterpiece, the living monument to his eternal reign. But behind its shimmering facade, the dream was beginning to rot. The soil that promised wealth now demanded blood. The settlers who arrived seeking fortune found fever instead. The air was thick, the mosquitoes endless, and the swamps seemed to breathe, devouring crops, homes, and men alike. They called it God's punishment, but it wasn't God who sent them here. It was the will of a king who believed that even the wilderness could be made to bow. The king's dream had come at a staggering cost. To build a colony that would rival the wealth of Spain's Mexico and England's Virginia, France emptied its prisons and slums. Men who had stolen bread were now sent to tame the bayous. Women were dragged from the streets of Paris to become brides in the colonies, some willing, most not. They called them les filles à la cassette, the casket girls, because all they carried were small wooden chests of belongings and a future written by someone else. But the swamp had no mercy. Many died before they ever saw the city they were promised. Others were lost to fever, storms, or despair. Those who survived built their homes on shifting ground, their foundations sinking into mud that would never stop moving. The land consumed lives as quickly as the crown consumed wealth. The king's treasury drained into Louisiana's endless hunger, ships, soldiers, settlers, supplies, and still the colony refused to flourish. The royal accountants began to whisper, Louisiana was bleeding France dry. But that was only the surface of the price. The deeper cost was human and hidden. Because to sustain the colony, the French turned to a darker kind of labor. They began importing enslaved Africans to work the plantations, forcing them to cultivate sugar and tobacco beneath a sun that showed no pity. Thousands were shipped across the Atlantic, bound in chains, branded with ownership, stripped of language, name, and freedom. And so, the king's dream, the one born of light, power, and divine ambition, was built upon human suffering. The empire's golden promise had a shadow that stretched across every cane field, every plantation, every unmarked grave. Even the settlers began to question the worth of it. Disease swept through the forts. Trade routes collapsed under English pressure. The indigenous nations who once traded with France began to turn away, betrayed by broken promises and greed. Louisiana had been imagined as a paradise, but it was becoming a graveyard of ambition. By the early 1700s, France's ministers were desperate. The colony was too expensive to abandon, too fragile to thrive. It became a political burden, a living symbol of a king's pride gone too far. The royal court began to lose interest. Versailles turned its gaze elsewhere, to wars in Europe, to grander displays of wealth and power. Louisiana, once the golden dream, became a distant echo, a kingdom forgotten even by its own creator. And when King Louis XIV died in 1715, his legacy stretched across the world. But his empire, like his body, had begun to decay. He left behind a crown weighed down by debt and an inheritance of instability, one that would pass from his gilded halls to his successors, each more desperate to hold what he could no longer control. The settlers in Louisiana didn't know it yet, but they were now living in the twilight of the French Empire in the New World. The cracks were forming, the rivals circling, the world shifting beneath their feet. For the king's dream had been paid for, in treasure, in blood, in the innocence of those who believed it could last forever. And soon, the price would come due not just for France, but for the entire world that sought to own this land. Because when empires dream too long, they forget one truth: no crown is meant to last forever. And in the heart of Louisiana, in the city the French built from mud and pride, the winds of change were already beginning to rise. The dream that had begun in the gilded halls of Versailles now trembled in the swamps of the Mississippi. The empire Louis XIV had carved into the New World, his Louisiana, was no longer a monument to his glory, but a fragile, flickering flame. The French called it a colony. But in truth, it had become a gamble, one wagered against time, rivals, and fate. By the mid-1700s, France's reach stretched from the icy forests of Canada to the burning deltas of the Gulf. On maps, the empire seemed unstoppable, a blue ribbon draped across a continent. But maps are liars. They show borders, not fractures. They show power, not desperation. And beneath that painted glory, the fractures were widening. England, swollen with ambition, was pushing westward from its Atlantic colonies. Spain lurked to the south, its eyes fixed on the Gulf. The native nations, long courted by France, were weary of its empty promises and deceit. Louisiana, once meant to be the crown's jewel, had become the empire's most vulnerable frontier, a prize everyone wanted but no one could truly hold. The first blow came not from the swamps, but from the battlefield. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, tore across continents. It was a war not just of soldiers, but of empires. France and England fought for dominion over the New World, and Louisiana, vast, undefended, and vital, stood caught in the crossfire. For 7 brutal years, blood soaked the frontier. Forts burned, rivers ran red, settlements vanished. And when the smoke cleared, France's empire lay in ruins. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, not in triumph, but in surrender. France handed over nearly all its North American territories. Canada went to Britain. And Louisiana, the land named for a king, was quietly passed to Spain. The French people of Louisiana woke up one morning to find their allegiance changed by ink and paper. No battles, no explosions, no choice. Just silence, and a foreign flag flying above their city. The fleur-de-lis came down. The red and gold of Spain rose in its place. The handover was so secret, so quietly done, that even the colonists didn't learn of it for years. When they finally did, outrage followed. Riots broke out in the streets of New Orleans. French settlers, proud, defiant, betrayed, demanded their identity back. But the Spanish came with soldiers, not sympathy. The rebellion was crushed, and for a moment, Louisiana, the land of Louis, seemed to lose its very soul. Under Spanish rule, life changed. The language softened into Creole. The architecture began to bend toward Andalusian design. The city rebuilt itself after fires with stucco walls and wrought iron balconies, the same balconies that today seem timeless, but were born from conquest and loss. Yet while the Spanish ruled the land, the French spirit refused to die. In taverns and churches, in back alleys and marketplaces, the old songs still echoed. French was still spoken behind closed doors. And though the crown had changed, the people still whispered the same name, Louisiana. But empires are fickle things, and Louisiana's story was not yet finished. 3 decades later, history turned once more. Across the Atlantic, another French leader rose, not a king this time, but a conqueror. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and his hunger for empire burned hotter than any monarch before him. To him, Louisiana was not just land, it was leverage, a pawn in his global game against Britain. He demanded it back from Spain, and the Spanish, weakened and cornered, obeyed. In 1800, by the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso, Louisiana was returned to France. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the fleur-de-lis was poised to rise again. But France's second chance would be shorter and stranger than anyone could have imagined. Napoleon had no intention of rebuilding a colony. He needed gold, not glory. He looked at Louisiana not as a kingdom to rule, but as a debt to sell. And in 1803, he did the unthinkable. For $15 million, less than 4 cents an acre, France sold Louisiana to the young United States. A land that once belonged to kings now belonged to a republic. The dream that had begun beneath a golden crown now passed into the hands of men who had sworn to destroy monarchy itself. It was over. The empire of Louis XIV, the divine vision that had crossed oceans and conquered rivers, had finally fallen. But even as the French flag was lowered for the last time, something lingered. The people of Louisiana, the descendants of settlers, slaves, and dreamers, did not vanish with the crown. They carried something deeper than empire, memory. And that memory, that stubborn, defiant French soul, would outlive every flag that rose and fell above it. Because while empires may crumble, culture endures. And in Louisiana, the French spirit would learn not just to survive, but to sing. Empires had come and gone, borders had shifted, and flags had been raised and lowered, but through it all, Louisiana's heartbeat never changed. The name, Louisiana, might have passed from king to conqueror, from France to Spain to America, but the spirit, that unmistakable rhythm born of French blood and New World struggle, refused to fade. When the French flag was lowered in 1803, many believed it marked the end of an era. But in truth, it was only the beginning of something far more enduring, the birth of a soul that no empire could own. For generations, the French settlers, Creoles, and Acadians had endured exile, conquest, and loss. They had watched their kings die, their lands change hands, their loyalties rewritten by treaties signed in distant rooms. But they had learned one lesson well: paper can change borders, but it cannot erase identity. In the humid streets of New Orleans, that identity thrived like jasmine on an iron fence, stubborn, fragrant, impossible to contain. French words still danced in the air, mingling with African rhythms and Spanish whispers, until they created something entirely new: Creole culture. It was a culture born of collision, where Catholic cathedrals stood beside voodoo altars, where European violins played alongside African drums, and where language itself began to bend and transform. Bonjour, met, bonjour, and somewhere in between, Louisiana found its voice. In the quarter, the architecture told its own story: French bones wearing Spanish skin. Balconies curled like lace over cobblestone streets. Courtyards hid fountains and secrets. Every stone seemed to remember something: a name, a song, a storm that passed and left its mark. And at night, when the heat settled and the city exhaled, another legacy stirred: music. Not the polished symphonies of Paris, but something raw and human, born from the sorrow of slaves, the resilience of settlers, and the longing of those who still dreamed of home. From that longing came jazz. Not written, not planned, but felt. A conversation between centuries, between the old world and the new, between joy and pain. In the clubs of Storyville, trumpets and pianos began to speak in a new language, one that carried the pulse of Africa, the soul of France, and the defiance of Louisiana. The French may have lost their empire, but in the streets of New Orleans, their spirit was reborn, freer, louder, and more alive than it had ever been under a crown. Even in the bayous, far from the city's lights, the echoes of France lingered. The Cajuns, descendants of exiled Acadians, built a world of their own. They hunted, fished, and prayed in French. Their songs, sung in sorrowful voices, told stories of love, exile, and endurance. They called their home Acadiana, a piece of old France hidden in the American South. Here, the French language didn't just survive, it adapted. It bent with the wind, rolled with the river, and spoke through the mouths of children who would never see France, but still felt it in their bones. And through wars, floods, and time itself, that French identity refused to bow. It became something greater, not royal, not European, but Louisianan. The city that France had founded became the cultural heartbeat of America's South, a place where faith turned to festivity, where tragedy birthed music, and where history was never buried, only transformed. But beneath the beauty, beneath the parades and laughter, the colors and sound, something darker stirred. A shadow that had always been part of the story, but one the world preferred to forget. Because while Louisiana's culture rose from resilience, it was also built on pain, on the suffering of those who had no freedom to claim a heritage, on the chains that rattled beneath the songs, on the silence of the enslaved. And the deeper one listens to Louisiana's music, the more one begins to hear what lies beneath it, a sorrow as old as the land itself. The French soul had refused to die, but it had also inherited the ghosts of its own making. And those ghosts were waiting in the shadows, the same shadows that still linger beneath Louisiana's glory. Every city has two faces, one it shows the world, and another it hides in silence. New Orleans was no different. Beneath its balconies draped with iron lace and streets echoing with brass bands, a darker current flowed, slow, deep, and ancient. The French soul had endured, yes, but it had done so through fire, oppression, and blood. And those who danced through Bourbon Street at night rarely stopped to ask what ghosts watched from the corners. Because in Louisiana, glory was never pure. It was forged from contradiction, beauty and cruelty, joy and suffering, faith and fear. Long before jazz filled the air, the rhythm of the land was the rhythm of chains. The fields outside the city were lined with plantations, their names elegant, their histories unspeakable. Cane and cotton thrived under the brutal sun, and so did the empire that fed on the backs of the enslaved. Those who built Louisiana's wealth were never invited into its celebration. They lived in the swamps, slept in shacks, prayed to gods who understood bondage, and yet, they left behind something eternal. A spiritual inheritance that would seep into every note, every drumbeat, every prayer whispered against the night. That pain, that unspoken sorrow, became the undercurrent of Louisiana's soul. You could hear it in the wail of a trumpet, feel it in the rhythm of a funeral march where joy and grief walked hand in hand. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation, the chains didn't simply vanish, they changed form. Freedom came, but equality did not. The Civil War had ended, but in Louisiana, the fight for the soul of the South had only just begun. The Reconstruction years brought chaos. Freedmen sought to build lives from ashes, while others, fearful of losing power, sought to bury them again beneath new laws and old hatred. Violence swept through parishes like a fever. Murders went unpunished. Churches burned, and yet, the people endured. And out of that endurance, a defiant culture rose, one that refused to die, no matter how many times it was silenced. Black preachers filled the churches, their voices thunderous with the promise of justice. Writers and poets found their voice in French Creole newspapers, defying the world to erase them. And in the backrooms of the city, under the flicker of lantern light, a secret language of faith was kept alive. Voodoo. To outsiders, it was feared, forbidden, but to those who practiced it, it was power. A blend of African spirituality, Catholic saints, and ancestral reverence, the faith of the enslaved reborn in defiance. The most famous of its keepers was a woman whose name still chills and fascinates, Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. Her presence was legend, equal parts saint and sorceress. She healed the sick, blessed the poor, and terrified the powerful. Politicians sought her counsel, priests whispered her name in both awe and condemnation. In a city that thrived on secrets, Marie Laveau was the secret. Through her, the unseen world of Louisiana revealed itself, the one that lay beneath the polished masks and Mardi Gras parades. A world where faith, magic, and fear intertwined. Where curses traveled through whispers. Where power flowed not from wealth, but from spirit. But every empire that glitters hides its rot. The plantations fell, but the poverty remained. The French charm faded, and the American dream proved selective. By the late 19th century, New Orleans was a city of extremes, decadence and decay, celebration and segregation. And yet, the soul of Louisiana remained unbroken. Its people turned every wound into art, every injustice into a rhythm, every heartbreak into a song. Still, the shadows never left. They lingered in the humidity, in the moss-draped cemeteries where the dead were buried above ground because even the soil refused to rest. They haunted the river, the levees, the French Quarter. And sometimes, they seemed to whisper warnings, as if the land itself remembered every injustice, every drop of blood spilled into its waters. Because Louisiana, for all its color and music, was always a place on the edge of beauty and destruction, of glory and ruin, and that edge would be tested again. The 20th century would bring storms no crown, no faith, and no culture could ever fully prepare it for. The shadows beneath the glory were stirring once more, this time not from human cruelty, but from the fury of nature itself. And when the waters came, they would wash through everything Louisiana thought it had built, revealing once again what truly endures when all else is gone. Louisiana has always lived on borrowed time, suspended between earth and water, between creation and collapse. It's a place that never fully belongs to the living, where the river gives life in one breath and takes it back in the next. And over the centuries, that fragile balance has been tested again and again, by fire, by flood, and by the relentless will to rise once more. The first great fire came in 1788, on Good Friday, when the heart of New Orleans ignited under a punishing wind. Wooden homes and narrow streets turned into chimneys of flame. In just a few hours, more than 850 buildings were gone. The church bells melted, the air thick with smoke and prayer. Survivors later said it felt as if the city itself had been judged. But out of those ashes, Louisiana refused to die. From the ruin emerged something unexpected, a new face, born of resilience and defiance. Spanish architecture replaced the old French timber. Iron balconies curled like lace against brick facades, as if the city decided that if it must burn, it would return more beautiful than before. Yet nature was not finished. The Mississippi River, the same force that fed the land, began to reveal its temper. It rose, fell, and rose again, always threatening to reclaim what it had given. In 1927, it did. The Great Mississippi Flood swallowed nearly 100 towns, displacing more than 500,000 people. Entire communities floated away. The rich escaped to higher ground, the poor were left clinging to rooftops. In those dark waters, the illusions of equality washed away, revealing the old divides that had never truly healed. And still, somehow, Louisiana endured. Out of the destruction came a new covenant between the people and the river. We will live with you, not against you. Levees were raised. Cities rebuilt. The culture deepened. Music, jazz, blues, gospel, became not just art but armor, a way to survive sorrow by turning it into sound. Then, in 2005, came the storm that would change everything, Hurricane Katrina. It began like all hurricanes, a swirl on a weather map, distant, almost abstract. But when it made landfall, it tore through the Gulf Coast with biblical fury. The levees, those man-made promises of safety, broke, and once again, Louisiana drowned. New Orleans became a ghost city overnight. Families climbed into attics to escape rising water, only to find no escape at all. The wind ripped apart history, churches, jazz clubs, entire neighborhoods vanished beneath the flood. But as the world watched, something else surfaced. The unbreakable spirit that had carried Louisiana through centuries of tragedy. Strangers pulled strangers from rooftops. Brass bands marched through the rubble. The dead were mourned, the living endured. And when the waters receded, the people returned, slowly, painfully, but with purpose. They didn't rebuild what was lost, they reinvented it. New Orleans became a living testament to survival, a city not defined by its disasters, but by what it creates from them. Out of Katrina's ruins came art, community, and defiance. The same resilience that had carried French settlers through swamp and war now carried their descendants through catastrophe. The city's heart still beat, weaker perhaps, but deeper. Fire had remade its skyline. Flood had remade its soul. And out of both, Louisiana had found its truest identity, not as a colony or a crown jewel, but as something elemental. A land that could not be erased. A spirit that refused to surrender. Every scar became a story. Every ghost, a guide. And when you walk through New Orleans today, past the rebuilt levees and the churches that still hum with gospel, you can feel it. A heartbeat made of memory and defiance, of centuries refusing to fade. Yet there remains one last mystery, one that not even time, fire, or flood could wash away, the name itself. Louisiana. It lingers on every sign, every song, every whispered prayer. But few truly know where it came from, or what it meant to the man who gave it. Because beneath the floods, the fires, and the centuries of change, the name still holds a secret, a royal echo that reaches all the way back to a king who once believed he could brand the world with his own light. And to understand Louisiana completely, you must go back to that beginning. To the mystery of the name itself. Names are promises. They carry authority, intention, and sometimes, a threat. In Louisiana's case, the name is a relic and a riddle, a royal stamp pressed into a landscape that never asked for it. To trace that name is to follow a faint, gilded thread from the muddy banks of the Mississippi back to a palace of mirrors, and to ask what one man's vanity can do to 1,000 lives. It began as an act both simple and enormous, an explorer planting a flag, a scribe writing a name, a monarch's signature inked on an ocean-spanning map. René Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle, stood at the river's mouth and declared the basin of this great river for his sovereign. He named the expanse La Louisiane, the land of Louis, and in that sentence turned the river into a realm and a realm into an inheritance. But ask different people what the name meant, and you will get different answers. For the courtiers in Versailles it was an extension of glory, a fresh chapter to be written in French gold. For the king, it was a brand, a guarantee that the Sun King's light reached where his feet never would. For settlers, it was a promise of new beginnings, stamped with the authority of a distant power. For indigenous nations, it was often an insult, a foreign label hastily stuck over places already named and lived in for centuries. Names, however, do more than identify, they reshape. To call this place Louisiana was to frame how it would be seen and governed, who would come to it, and who would be pushed aside. A crown's syllable carried weight. It suggested lines to be drawn, taxes to be levied, armies to be sent. It implied ownership in a world where ownership was enforced by force, not by consent. But there is a tension in every name that outlives its origin. The man Louis XIV imagined a transatlantic cathedral of his rule. The land responded with swamp, storm, and stubborn peoples who did not answer to Versailles. Still, the name clung. It threaded into language, woven into the daily speech of markets and churches. It became a map's constant even when the map itself kept changing hands. There are subtler mysteries, too. How did a royal name so quickly become local? How did La Louisiane, official and foreign, soften into Louisiana, pronounced with a Creole drawl, worn by people who had never knelt before any French throne? The answer is not in treaties or proclamations but in the quiet labor of memory. Mothers teaching children words that mixed old country vowels with river slang. Bakers advertising pain perdu in a sign next to Creole gumbo. Brass bands playing fanfares once meant for princes at the same time they played the laments of the oppressed. And the name kept absorbing other stories. Enslaved Africans brought names from the coasts of West Africa that were never erased but braided into the place. In rhythms, in saints, in secret prayers. Acadians renamed their sorrow home Acadiana. Spanish governors, American officials, and Creole elites each layered their own meanings onto the syllables. Louisiana's name became a palimpsest. Every ruler thought they had written the final line, but the land's people kept writing over it. That palimpsest makes the name slippery. It can be invoked as heritage or weaponized as nostalgia. It comforts, a banner under which festivals gather, a shorthand for food, music, and ritual. But it also obscures the debts underneath. The forced labor that fed markets named in elegant French, the treaties ignored when a map suited a ruler's strategy, the lives erased so a syllable could sparkle on a map. There is also a quieter, almost poetic irony embedded in the word. Louis, a name of kings, of courts and luxury, sits next to Yana, a suffix that turns personal into place, king into country. It is as if the monarch's private signature was stretched into geography, a signature that was never asked for yet somehow took root. That stretch reminds us how power often works. A single decision in a throne room can echo as law, as label, as destiny for people who never saw the king's face. Still, the mystery deepens when we consider how a name survives trauma. Fires razed blocks. Floods swallowed neighborhoods. Regimes changed flags in secret treaties, and yet the name persisted. Why? Because names are less about rulers and more about stories people choose to keep. The music, the Creole tongue, the food, the funeral marches, these are all carriers of the name, living testimonies that demand the syllable be spoken, remembered, reinterpreted. So when you say, Louisiana, today you are speaking many things at once. a royal claim, a region of tragedies and triumphs, a cultural expression that refused to be erased. The word holds contradictions, beauty sewn to brutality, joy threaded with sorrow. It is a name that has outlived the monarch's intent and mutated into something larger and far more human. And yet, there remains a certain spectral image that accompanies the name, the idea of a crown reflected in water. The king's signature may have been written on maps, but its truest echo is found where the river mirrors the sky. A pale, trembling crown, never quite whole, always wavering with the current. That reflection asks a final question before the story closes. What does it mean when a crown's image survives not on a throne, but on the face of a river that has seen everything? The river answers better than any treaty could, and its answer leads us to the last act of this tale, where name, people, and water converge into a single, unforgettable truth. At sunrise, the Mississippi looks like molten glass, golden, slow-moving, eternal. The same river that once carried French explorers, enslaved souls, soldiers, traders, and dreamers still winds its way past the cypress and willows, unbothered by time. It has seen kingdoms rise and vanish, cities burn and rebuild, and still it moves, steady, patient, indifferent. Somewhere in that reflection, if you look long enough, you can almost see it. The faint glimmer of a crown, not one of jewels and gold, but one of memory. It trembles on the surface for just a moment, then fades with the current, as if the river itself is reminding us that no power lasts forever. Louisiana began as a vision of empire, a king's name stamped onto a wilderness. But what remains today is not his rule, not his pride, not even his nation. What endures is the people who turned that foreign dream into their own story, who bled, sang, prayed, and rebuilt until the land no longer belonged to any crown but to itself. Every piece of Louisiana tells that story. The iron balconies that survived fire, the jazz that rose from sorrow, the Creole words that outlived their masters. The streets of New Orleans don't whisper the glory of Louis XIV anymore. They echo the laughter of children playing in alleys, the hum of gospel choirs, the beat of second-line parades, sounds that could never have been imagined in Versailles. The name that once symbolized power has become a hymn to endurance. Louisiana, once meant to honor a king, now honors everyone who refused to disappear under his shadow. It's a name that carries the weight of centuries and the light of rebirth, all at once. And the river, that eternal witness, keeps flowing. It carries the echoes of every age, the cries of explorers, the songs of slaves, the prayers after hurricanes. If you stand by its banks at dusk, you might hear it murmur, a sound that's part wind, part memory, part warning. Because Louisiana's story has never really ended. It's a living cycle, of loss and rebirth, of beauty rising from ruin. A story written not by kings, but by ordinary people who refused to be erased. The crown that once claimed this land has long since rusted into myth. But in the ripples of the Mississippi, another kind of crown lives on, one forged not of gold, but of resilience. A crown worn by no single ruler, but by a people, a culture, a spirit too wild to be conquered. So when the sun sets over the delta, and the river turns to liquid fire, remember this. The king's name may still rest on the map. But the soul of Louisiana belongs to the river, and to those who learn to rise with it, again and again.